The sky above Headal hung heavy, a tapestry of bruised purple and slate grey, stitched with lightning that pulsed like the faltering heartbeat of a forsaken deity. The city perched precariously on the lip of the Abyssal Rift, a fathomless wound in the earth that swallowed light and sound, exhaling only cryptic murmurs carried on gusts of wind. Headal was no sanctuary of grandeur or plenty, it was a crucible of endurance, its streets hewn from jagged stone, its people tempered by hardship. The air was a bitter blend of ash and brine, and scars, visible or not, were the currency of belonging. Kalia of Vren, at 17, was no exception. She was a wisp of a girl, wiry and unassuming, with calloused hands and a tangle of raven hair that perpetually veiled her amber eyes. Her days were a litany of toil, hauling water from corroded pumps that groaned like dying beasts, stitching nets for the fishers who tempted fate along the rift's edge, and tending to the fragile threads of her family. Her mother, Lysa, was a wraith of a woman, her frame dwindling beneath a cough that shook their ramshackle home like a storm against brittle glass. Her brother, Torin, 9 and all angles, sharp elbows, sharper curiosity, clung to questions about their father, a man lost to the rift's depths years ago. Kalia had no answers to give. She had duties, and she bore them with a quiet grit that belied her youth. Yet beneath her pragmatism simmered something she couldn't name, a faint hum in her bones, a flicker of heat that surged when anger or fear gripped her. She dismissed it as fatigue or the gnawing ache of an empty belly. In Headal, where survival trumped wonder, such mysteries were luxuries she couldn't afford. Her greatest hope was a night unbroken by Lysa's labored breathing, a small, fleeting dream that crumbled the day the Harbingers descended. It began with a sound, a deep, resonant thrum that clawed its way up from the rift, as if the abyss itself had stirred from an ancient slumber. Kalia was in the market, her fingers deftly negotiating a tattered net for a clutch of withered potatoes, when the earth shuddered. Stalls buckled. Voices rose in jagged cries. The potatoes slipped from her grasp as she bolted, her boots hammering the fractured stone while the thrum swelled into a deafening roar. She reached her street as the sky darkened to a starless void, the air snapping with an electric bite. Lysa stood at the window, her frail silhouette quivering. Torin clung to her skirts, his wide eyes locked on the horizon. Kalia, Lysa croaked, her voice a frayed thread. What's happening? I don't know, Kalia said, shouldering past to peer out. Her breath snagged in her throat. From the cliffs above the rift, figures emerged, tall, cloaked specters gliding with an unnatural elegance, their forms rippling like mirages over a forge. The Harbingers. Whispers of them haunted Headal's firesides, beings of shadow and flame, birthed in the rift's uncharted heart, reapers of whatever they deemed their due. Souls? Blood? Something more arcane? No one knew. Those they claimed simply vanished. They moved in silence, cloaks trailing wisps of smoke, neither marching nor announcing their intent, just advancing, implacable as a tide. Townsfolk scattered, some brandishing rusted blades, others muttering prayers to gods who'd turned their backs. Kalia's pulse thundered. She seized Torin's hand and yanked Lysa from the window. We need to hide. There's no hiding, Lysa whispered, her voice splintering. They always find what they want. Then we run, Kalia growled, thrusting a threadbare cloak into her mother's trembling hands. Where to? She didn't know. Headal's cliffs and chasms boxed them in like a trap, but inaction was a death sentence. She hauled them through the back door into the labyrinth of alleys, the town's arteries of stone and shadow. Behind them, screams pierced the air, underscored by flashes of orange light as the Harbingers set homes ablaze, their destruction methodical, relentless. They reached the old mill, a skeletal husk teetering near the rift's brink. Its walls were stout, its cellar a deep, dank refuge. Kalia kicked aside a moldering crate and herded Lysa and Torin down the splintered ladder. "Stay quiet," she hissed, her hands unsteady as she dragged the trapdoor shut. Darkness engulfed them, pierced only by a sliver of light seeping through a crack overhead. Torin's whimpers mingled with Lysa's ragged coughs. Kalia pressed herself against the damp wall, straining to hear. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunched above. A shadow eclipsed the crack, and the air thickened with a stifling heat. The hum beneath Kalia's skin flared, a sharp, insistent pulse, but she clenched her fists, willing it silent. Not now. She couldn't falter. The trapdoor groaned. Torin choked back a sob. Kalia snatched a rusted shovel from the dirt, her palms slick with sweat. If they were found, she'd fight, clueless but defiant. The trapdoor held. Instead, a voice slithered through the seams, low and searing, like embers spitting in a fire. "We smell it. The spark. The ember. Yield it, or we claim all." Lysa's fingers dug into Kalia's arm. "What do they mean?" "I don't know," Kalia breathed, but the hum in her veins surged, a rhythm she couldn't stifle. Heat coiled in her chest, wild and ravenous, pleading for release. She crushed it down, gripping the shovel tighter. The footsteps withdrew, but their words lingered, a venomous promise. They cowered in the cellar for hours, the distant wails of Headal fading into a hollow stillness. When Kalia finally emerged, the town was a mausoleum of ash. Smoldering husks of homes dotted the streets, and bodies lay crumpled, their flesh charred as if incinerated from within. The Harbingers had retreated, but their presence stained the air, a vow of return. Kalia guided Lysa and Torin back to their house, spared by some capricious mercy, and pieced together a fragile plan. Whispers among the survivors spoke of a pattern. The Harbingers took their prize and left desolation in their wake. But what prize? The spark. The ember. The words gnawed at her, a puzzle with no edges. Days crept by, taut with dread. Kalia scavenged what scraps she could, scorched bread, a battered pot, while Lysa's strength waned and Torin's chatter dwindled to silence. The hum in her veins became a constant shadow, unyielding. At night, she dreamed of fire, flames that curled in her palms, warm yet unburning, alive with a will of their own. Then the Harbingers returned. Dusk painted the sky in crimson streaks when the rift's thrum erupted anew. Kalia was atop their roof, patching a jagged hole with scavenged slate, when she saw them, dozens now, their cloaks billowing like storm fronts, descending with purpose toward her street. Her gut plummeted. She slid down the ladder, shouting, "They are back. Cellar, now." Lysa faltered, her legs buckling. Torin tugged at her, his face a mask of panic. Kalia slung her mother's arm over her shoulder, staggering under the frail weight, and kicked open the cellar door. But the Harbingers were swifter. A blast of heat slammed into her, hurling her to her knees. Lysa slipped free, and Torin's scream cut the air as a cloaked figure loomed, its hand outstretched, trailing tongues of flame. "Yield the ember," it rasped, its voice a dagger of sound. "No?" Kalia lunged, shoving Torin behind her. The hum in her chest detonated, a flood of heat and light she could no longer cage. Her hands thrust forward, and fire, molten, golden, alive, erupted from her palms. It crashed into the Harbinger, a tempest of flame that roared with primal fury. The creature shrieked, its form disintegrating into ash. Kalia staggered, staring at her trembling hands. The fire had vanished, but its echo pulsed in her veins. Lysa gaped, speechless. Torin whispered, "Kalia, what was that?" "I don't know," she choked out, her mind reeling. But the Harbingers understood. More pressed in, their voices a ravenous chorus. The Ember wakes. It is ours. They surged, a maelstrom of shadow and fire. Kalia reacted on instinct, her hands slashing the air. Flames roared forth, weaving a blazing wall between her family and the onslaught. She didn't comprehend it, couldn't fathom its source, but the power flowed like a river, fierce and unbroken. She advanced, driving them back, her breath tearing from her lungs in gasps. Yet they were legion. For each she incinerated, two rose in its stead. Her limbs quaked, the heat sapping her strength. A Harbinger breached her barrier, seizing Lysa in a grip of flame. Another snatched Torin, his cries piercing her heart. Kalia screamed, her fire flickering. "Stop," she sobbed, collapsing to her knees. "Take me. It's me you want." The Harbingers stilled, their eyeless gazes boring into her. The one clutching Lysa spoke, its voice a molten hiss. "The Ember is yours, but its root lies in the rift. Surrender it, and they live." Her thoughts spun. Surrender what? This power? Her life? She didn't even grasp its nature. But Torin's muffled sobs and Lysa's wheezing breaths tethered her. She rose, the hum swelling into a crescendo. "Fine," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing her throat. "Let them go first." The Harbingers complied, releasing her family. Lysa clutched Torin, their eyes brimming with dread and plea. "Don't," Lysa rasped. "I have to," Kalia said, forcing a brittle smile. She faced the Harbingers. "Take it." They closed in, their flames licking her skin, searing yet cold. But as they reached for her, the hum didn't wane, it deepened, a symphony of untapped might. The fire wasn't theirs to claim. It was hers, born in her blood, not stolen from the rift. Their words were a deception, a snare to bind her. "No," she snarled, and the fire erupted anew, not a mere blaze, but a cataclysm of gold and ivory, radiant and unstoppable. It engulfed the Harbingers, their shrieks swallowed by the inferno as their forms unraveled into nothingness. The blast quaked Headal, splitting stone and rending the silence. When the light dimmed, Kalia stood amidst the ashes, breathless, her family trembling but unharmed behind her. The silence that followed was a fragile thing. Headal rose from its wounds, scarred yet defiant. Kalia became a whispered myth, the girl who turned flame against the Harbingers and won. She didn't feel mythic. She felt raw, unmoored, her power a vast enigma she'd only begun to explore. It wasn't mere fire, it was vitality, defiance, a spark no force could extinguish. In the quiet hours, she honed it, tracing its contours, embracing its depths. Lysa's health rallied, buoyed by a fragile hope. Torin shadowed Kalia, his endless questions a tether to normalcy she couldn't yet answer. But they were whole, and that was enough. The rift still murmured, its secrets a siren's call. Kalia knew the Harbingers, or something darker, might return. Yet she stood ready. The ember once veiled within her was hers alone, a requiem of strength she'd wield to guard her own.